Imagine waking up on a June morning in 1816. You look out your window expecting to see your crops growing tall in the summer sun. Instead, you see something that makes your blood run cold. Snow. In the middle of June, in New England. This isn't fiction. This actually happened. And what came next nearly destroyed the young American nation and changed the course of human history forever. In 1816, something catastrophic happened that most people today have completely forgotten. The sun seemed to disappear. Crops failed worldwide. People starved by the thousands. Riots erupted across Europe. And here in America, families were forced to make unthinkable decisions just to survive. Here on The Forgotten Past, we dig deep into the stories that shaped our world, but somehow slipped through the cracks of history. Today, we're uncovering the mystery of 1816, the year without summer, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this forgotten catastrophe matters more than you ever imagined. We'll discover what really caused this nightmare, how ordinary Americans survived the impossible, and the surprising ways this disaster changed everything from what we eat to the books we read. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how shocking this catastrophe was, we need to picture America in early 1816. The United States was still a young nation, only 40 years old. The War of 1812 had just ended, and Americans were optimistic about the future. The population stood at around 8.5 million people, and roughly 80% of them were farmers. This was a time before modern conveniences. There were no grocery stores, no refrigeration, no way to import food quickly from distant places. If you wanted to eat, you grew it yourself, or you traded with your neighbor who did. Every family lived and died by the success of their harvest. The farming calendar was everything. Spring meant planting, summer meant growth. Fall meant harvest. Winter meant survival on what you'd stored. This rhythm had governed human life for thousands of years, and Americans in 1816 had no reason to think this year would be any different. As April arrived, farmers across New England planted their crops as they always had. Corn, wheat, oats, rye, the staples of American life. May brought the usual spring rains and warming temperatures. Children played in the fields. Farmers watched their crops sprout and begin to grow. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed right. But as May turned to June, farmers across New England began noticing something wasn't right. The temperatures weren't rising as they should. The nights were unusually cold. And then came June 6, 1816, a date that would live in infamy. Let me tell you exactly what happened, day by day. June 6, 1816, started like many early summer days. Farmers rose early to tend their fields. But as the day progressed, something strange began to happen. The temperature started to drop, not just cooling off, plummeting. By afternoon, people were pulling on winter coats. By evening, they were huddling around fires. And then, as darkness fell across New England, something impossible happened. It began to snow. Sarah Snell Bryant, a farmer's wife in Cummington, Massachusetts, wrote in her diary, "Great frost, almost everything killed." In Vermont, farmers watched in horror as snow accumulated on their June gardens. In New Hampshire, ice formed on ponds that had been thawed for months. Children who had been playing in summer clothes just days before now stood shivering, watching snowflakes fall from June skies. Parents who had lived their entire lives by the predictable rhythm of seasons suddenly faced something they couldn't explain, couldn't understand, and couldn't fight. The morning of June 7th revealed the devastating truth. Crops that had been green and thriving were now blackened and dead, killed by the hardest frost many had ever experienced. And this was supposed to be summer. But June 6th was only the beginning. Throughout June, July, and August of 1816, frost struck again and again. There were killing freezes in every single month of what should have been summer. On July 9th, ice as thick as window glass covered water buckets in Connecticut. In August, Lakes and rivers froze solid in parts of New England. Birds fell from the sky, frozen to death. Sheep that had just been sheared died from the cold. Corn stalks that should have been knee-high stood blackened and withered. Farmers kept replanting, kept hoping that normal summer weather would return. They replanted in June after the first frost killed their crops. Then they replanted again in July. Some tried a third time in August, but each time the killing frost returned. Old-timers said they'd never seen anything like it. Religious communities believed it was divine punishment. Some thought the end of the world had come. But nobody, absolutely nobody, understood what was really happening. But here's what nobody in America knew at that moment. This wasn't just a local problem. Across the entire world, catastrophe was unfolding. And the cause, it had begun 1 year earlier, 10,000 miles away. April 10th, 1815, a date that literally changed the world's climate. On the island of Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia, Mount Tambora, a volcano that had been quiet for centuries, suddenly came to life. And when it erupted, it did so with a force that staggers the imagination. This wasn't just any volcanic eruption. Mount Tambora produced the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. To put it in perspective, it was 10,000 times more powerful than the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. Scientists classify it as a VEI 7, a colossal eruption, a category so rare that it might happen only once or twice in 1,000 years. The explosion could be heard 1,200 miles away. The entire top of the mountain, over 4,000 feet of it, simply disintegrated. 71,000 people died immediately, buried under ash and rock, or killed by the tsunamis that followed. But the real devastation wasn't just local. Mount Tambora ejected 160 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pumice into the atmosphere. Most critically, it released massive amounts of sulfur dioxide gas that rose all the way into the stratosphere. Up there, 30,000 feet above the Earth's surface, that sulfur dioxide mixed with water vapor and created tiny particles called sulfate aerosols. These particles spread around the entire planet, forming a veil that blocked sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface. The result was a drop in global temperatures of somewhere between 0.7 and 1.3 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but it was enough to turn summer into something unrecognizable. Enough to kill crops worldwide. Enough to trigger starvation, disease, and chaos across multiple continents. But here's the remarkable thing. Almost nobody in America knew about the Tambora eruption. There was no global news network, no internet, no way for information to travel quickly around the world. Many Americans wouldn't learn about the volcano for years, so when the snow fell in June, when the frost killed their crops in July, when summer never came, Americans had no idea why. They couldn't see the enemy. They couldn't understand the cause. They couldn't fight back. All they could do was try to survive. So now Americans faced an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't fight. The question became, how do you survive when summer itself has died? For ordinary American families, 1816 became a desperate fight for survival. As summer progressed and the killing frosts kept coming, the reality set in, there would be no harvest. The corn that was supposed to feed families and livestock through the winter was dead in the fields. The wheat that should have made bread was destroyed. The oats, the rye, the vegetables in family gardens, all gone. In many areas of New England, crop yields dropped by 90% or more. 90%. Think about what that means. If a family needed 100 bushels of corn to survive the winter, they now had 10. And the crisis extended beyond just crops. Hay didn't grow, which meant there was no food for horses and cattle. Farmers faced an impossible choice: let their animals starve, or slaughter them now, and try to preserve the meat, knowing that without livestock, they'd have no way to farm next year. The economic impact was immediate and crushing. The price of grain, corn, wheat, oats, increased by 500 to 1,000% in some areas. A bushel of corn that might have cost 50 cents before 1816 was now selling for $5 or $6 if you could find it at all. For families who had lost their own crops, this meant starvation was a real possibility. Life savings were wiped out, just trying to buy enough food to survive. Banks foreclosed on farms. Families who had worked the same land for generations lost everything. People ate things they never thought they would have to eat. Seed corn, the carefully selected kernels meant for planting next year's crop, went into cooking pots instead. Families trapped and ate hedgehogs, raccoons, anything they could catch. Wild roots that were normally considered cattle feed became human food. Some accounts describe poverty soup, nothing more than hot water with a little pepper, and whatever grease could be scraped together. In the worst-hit areas, families ate their breeding livestock, knowing it meant they'd have no way to rebuild their herds. Malnutrition became widespread, especially among children. And malnutrition brought disease. Typhus, tuberculosis, and other illnesses swept through weakened communities. Infant mortality rates spiked. Town records from 1816 and 1817 show death rates far above normal. Families were torn apart. Fathers left to seek work in cities or on canal projects, leaving wives and children behind. Some families never reunited. Letters from the period reveal heartbreaking stories of separation, of children sent to live with relatives who had fared better, of elderly parents who didn't survive the crisis. But for many New England families, there was one option that seemed to offer hope: leave. Abandon the rocky soil of New England and head west to the frontier lands of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And so began one of the great migrations in American history. Thousands of families, some estimates say tens of thousands, loaded whatever possessions they could carry into wagons and headed west. They traveled along rough roads, across mountains, into territories that were still largely unsettled. These climate refugees, though they wouldn't have used that term, were literally fleeing the year without summer. In the decades that followed, a common saying emerged in New England: 1800 and froze to death. But while New England suffered, it was nothing compared to what was happening across the Atlantic. In Europe, the year without summer was triggering something far darker. While Americans struggled, the rest of the world was descending into chaos. Europe in 1816 was already vulnerable. The continent had just emerged from more than 2 decades of the Napoleonic Wars. Economies were shattered, infrastructure was damaged, food reserves were low, and then came the year without summer. The pattern was the same across the continent. Spring started normally, but summer never arrived. Crops failed in France, Germany, Switzerland, Britain, and across Eastern Europe. But unlike America, Europe didn't have vast frontier lands to escape to. The population density was much higher, and when the food ran out, there was nowhere to go. The result was catastrophe on a scale America was spared. Food riots erupted across France. Starving mobs attacked grain stores and bakeries. In Switzerland, the government declared a national emergency. In Germany, people ate cats, dogs, and even grass in desperate attempts to survive. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that tens of thousands died directly from starvation, and many more from the diseases that followed malnutrition. Ireland suffered particularly. Typhus epidemic swept through the weakened population, killing an estimated 65,000 people. This tragedy foreshadowed the even greater potato famine that would strike Ireland 30 years later. In Asia, the impacts were equally devastating. China experienced summer snowfall in some regions, an unprecedented event. The failed monsoons in India triggered crop failures that led to widespread famine. And in Bengal, conditions created the perfect environment for a cholera pandemic that would eventually spread across the world, killing millions over the next several years. In America, most people had no idea how lucky they were. Yes, they suffered. Yes, they struggled. Yes, some died. But Americans had advantages that much of the world didn't have. They had wild game to hunt in forests that still covered much of the continent. They had frontier lands to escape to. They didn't have massive armies to feed or war-torn infrastructure to repair. The young American nation, precisely because it was still developing and relatively sparse in population, had a resilience that more established societies lacked. But here's the remarkable thing. From this darkness, from this suffering, came unexpected innovation and creation that still affects your life today. History has a strange way of creating beauty from catastrophe. The year without summer changed the world in ways that nobody at the time could have predicted, and some of those changes are still with us today. First, there's the Great Migration we talked about. Those thousands of New England families who fled west didn't just move, they built America's heartland. The populations of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois exploded in the years following 1816. Towns and cities that are still thriving today were founded by climate refugees from the year without summer. These migrants brought their values, their work ethic, their politics with them. They shaped the Midwest into what it would become. In a very real sense, the America we know today was partially shaped by that volcanic eruption half a world away. Then there's the bicycle. Now this connection isn't obvious, but follow the logic. The crop failures meant there was no hay to feed horses. Horses across Europe died by the hundreds of thousands. This transportation crisis led inventors to search for alternatives to horse-powered travel. In Germany, Karl Dreis invented the velocipede, an early version of the bicycle, in 1817, directly in response to the horse shortage. That invention evolved into the modern bicycle, but perhaps the most famous creation to emerge from the year without summer happened in Switzerland, on the shores of Lake Geneva. In June of 1816, the poet Lord Byron was staying in a villa with some friends, including a young woman named Mary Shelley. The weather that summer was atrocious. Cold, dark, gloomy, with constant rain. They were trapped indoors day after day. To pass the time, Byron suggested they each write a ghost story. Mary Shelley, just 18 years old, began working on a tale about a scientist who creates life from dead tissue. The darkness of that summer, the gloom, the sense of nature itself being out of balance, all of it poured into her story. That story became Frankenstein, one of the most influential novels ever written. The birth of modern science fiction and horror happened because a volcano in Indonesia made summer disappear. The year without summer also forced agricultural innovation. Farmers began experimenting with cold-resistant crop varieties. Food preservation methods improved. Crop diversification became more common. The seeds of agricultural science, which would eventually transform farming, were planted partly in response to the crisis of 1816. And there were political changes too. The migration west shifted America's center of gravity. New states entered the Union. Political power began moving away from the eastern seaboard. The expansion that 1816 accelerated would shape American politics for generations. The survivors of 1816 were forever changed. They had learned that nature was not always predictable, that stability could vanish overnight, that summer itself could die. But the question we need to ask ourselves is this: what did they know that we've forgotten? Now, you might be wondering why this matters in 2026. After all, we have modern agriculture, global food networks, advanced weather forecasting, climate science. Surely we're safe from something like the year without summer happening again, right? Not necessarily. The truth is, we're still vulnerable to climate disruption, perhaps even more so than people were in 1816. Our global food system is more complex now, but complexity brings fragility. We depend on just-in-time delivery systems that maintain very little surplus. Most cities have only a few days' worth of food in their supply chains. Our crops are often monocultures, vast fields of genetically identical plants that are productive but vulnerable. If a volcanic eruption the size of Tambora happened today, the impact could actually be more catastrophic in some ways. We feed a global population of 8 billion people, compared to 1 billion in 1816. Our agriculture is optimized for current climate conditions. A sudden shift could be devastating. And it's not just theoretical. In 1991, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted, not as large as Tambora, but still significant. Global temperatures dropped measurably. Harvests were affected worldwide. We got a small taste of what Tambora did, and even that small taste caused disruption. More recently, the eruption of Eyjafjallajökull in Iceland in 2010 shut down air travel across Europe for days. That was a relatively minor eruption. Imagine if something like Tambora happened today. But it's not all doom and gloom. The story of 1816 also teaches us about human resilience. Think about what those people endured. No government aid programs, no Red Cross, no modern medicine, no grocery stores, no importing food from around the world. They had their hands, their minds, their communities, and their determination. And they survived. More than that, they rebuilt. They innovated, they adapted, they created beauty even in darkness. Remember Frankenstein. They found new lands and built new lives. The year without summer reminds us that humans are extraordinarily resilient when we need to be. It also reminds us of the importance of community. The families who survived 1816 often did so because neighbors helped neighbors. Communities shared what little they had. People looked out for each other. And finally, 1816 teaches us about memory and forgetting. Within just 2 generations, the year without summer had largely faded from American memory. People knew it had happened, but the visceral understanding, the lessons learned, the adaptations made, much of that was lost. For many of you watching, your own ancestors may have lived through this. Your family might have been part of that great migration west. Your hometown might exist because of the year without summer. This isn't just history, this is your story. So the next time you look up at a clear summer sky, or bite into fresh corn in July, or complain about the heat, remember 1816. Remember the families who watched snow fall in June and didn't know if they'd survive the winter. Remember that nature is more powerful than we like to admit. Remember that our ancestors endured the unimaginable, and that's why we're here today. The year without summer reminds us of 3 crucial truths. First, that climate can change dramatically and faster than we expect. The people of 1816 went from normal spring weather to summer snow in a matter of weeks. Stability is not guaranteed. Second, that human resilience is extraordinary. These people didn't have grocery stores, or government aid, or modern technology. They had each other, their ingenuity, and their determination, and it was enough. And third, that we forget. Just 1 generation after 1816, this catastrophe had already faded from memory. What else have we forgotten? What other lessons from our past are we ignoring? Here on The Forgotten Past, we're committed to uncovering these lost stories because the past has so much to teach us if we're willing to listen. Now I want to hear from you. Had you heard of the year without summer before this video? Do you have family stories passed down about 1816 or unusual weather? What other forgotten disasters should we cover? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your suggestions help shape future episodes. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We post new forgotten history stories every week, and trust me, we have some incredible stories coming up. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, the past may be forgotten, but here we bring it back to life. Here on The Forgotten Past, and I'll see you in the next episode.